All right, welcome to Crossroads. Folks, equal protection has been restored, it's back, and identity politics, which have been merged into American legal systems, well, that's all now over. The Justice Department is rolling this back, restoring what used to represent principles of equal protection under the law, regardless of gender or race or anything else. In other news, the United States has a new national security strategy, and this is pretty dang significant. I'm going to be going into the details of what's actually in it. This doesn't even just change policy. This changes what America fundamentally represents globally as a nation. And on another topic, well, a lot else going on. We'll be getting into these details, we'll be going into the policies of it. And that said, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, first of all, identity politics have been merged into American law, in case you haven't noticed. And this led to issues where a person's race or their gender or their identity or whatever else has been used to weigh guilt or innocence. And even the severity of punishments in some cases, like whether you get off the hook or you go to jail for a very long time. But now the Justice Department is rolling this back, and it's restoring what used to represent the principles of equal protection under the law. Let me show you what they're saying. They say today the Justice Department issued a final rule updating its regulations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It says this rule ensures that our nation's federal civil rights laws are firmly grounded in the principle of equal treatment under the law by eliminating disparate impact liability from its Title VI regulations. And they say, quote, for decades, the Justice Department has used disparate impact liability to undermine the constitutional principle that all Americans must be treated equally under the law, said Attorney General Pamela Bondi. And she said, no longer, this Department of Justice is eliminating regulations that for far too long required recipients of federal funding to make decisions based on race. Briefly on this was the difference, right? So the Civil Rights Act, 1964, it does actually ban racial discrimination, gender discrimination, the whole 9 yards. And for a long time, the nature of racism or sexism was based on actual discrimination. So the older definition, which we've gone over before, if you read the dictionary from 20 years ago, would say that racism is when you make a prejudgment on someone based on their race, effectively, right? That you think one race is superior, one race is evil, and everybody in that is just labeled a certain way. They actually changed that definition. Racism, as currently defined in Webster, and I'm not talking about the government redefining, I mean Webster Dictionary. They've redefined it as social economics. And it's through this idea, which is equality of outcome, not of opportunity, not of freedom, meaning if, for example, there's a disparity in the ability of one race to make a let's say become rich versus poor, meaning one race of people is more likely to be on poverty, one race of people is more likely to be in jail, then they believe that that is a system issue, right? Systemic racism. The system itself is to blame for this. And so the argument was, in order to enact the again, civil rights laws, you need to make it so there's equality of outcome, that the system alters things in such a way so that we all reach the same outcome, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of whatever else. And that has really defined the reinterpretation of civil rights laws, at least under the Biden administration. It was not like that during Trump's first term, of course. This was mostly Biden-era interpretations. And their argument again was that that was their interpretation of civil rights, that the policies to eliminate discrimination should result in equality of outcome, right? You're discriminating if the system does not create equal outcomes. What the Trump administration is now doing is they're actually saying that actually represents racism. That actually does represent discrimination, because the reality is you cannot manufacture outcomes without giving preferential treatment to one group and basically persecute another. And the argument for a long time was, in schools they were discriminating against white people and Asians because there were too many of them, and so they had to balance things out. Businesses, government jobs were discriminating very heavily against white people, against straight people if you weren't homosexual. in order to balance things out. And if you had, for example, a trans identity, or you were deemed a minority, or you had another issue that they don't have enough representation of, you were given preferential treatment. You had more access. So that was the old interpretation. The way they're changing it now is more of a conventional, old school view of what is racism, which is equality of opportunity. Lady Justice is blind, not equality of outcome. But Pam Bondi continues by saying this. She says the prior disparate impact regulations encourage people to file lawsuits challenging racially neutral policies. I don't see your race. Well, that's racist, right? She says without evidence of intentional discrimination. So the guy might not have meant to be racist, but you interpreted it that way. You felt it was racist. Now, Assistant Attorney General Harmeet K. Dillon said this. She's of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. And she added, our rejection of this theory will restore true equality under the law by requiring proof of actual discrimination rather than enforcing race or sex-based quotas or assumptions. So the way this worked in terms of law is if you went and applied for a job somewhere, if you went to a government job or even in the military and you see too many white people getting promoted, you see that the white people make more money than you, based on that alone, you could say, well, I'm not of that race, and you're giving more of them than me, this kind of like access or raises or whatever else, and you would sue them for that. There were businesses, for example, that did like performance reviews, and the performance reviews tended to show that one race performed better than another. People were suing because of performance reviews, because it showed a disparate result. One certain group of people performed better than others. They said that the system itself was racist for saying that. If they were filing lawsuits, government agencies were getting sued, businesses were getting sued, schools were getting sued, and that was the justice system for the last 4 years under Biden. They're changing that. Now they continue by saying this. For over 50 years, the prior disparate impact rule, because they're talking about again, not just under Biden in this case, they're even talking about how it's been applied previously, even during Trump's first term, in other words. The prior disparate impact rule fostered the very thing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited, discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. But with today's rule, said Chief of Staff and Supervisory Official for the Office of Legal Policy, Nicholas Schilling, the federal department reaffirms Congress's commitment to measure all Americans by merit. And what are they talking about in terms of the 50 years? They're talking about affirmative action, right? That's affirmative action. Well, you know what? You don't have enough people of my race here, therefore you're obviously racist and I'm going to sue you. And that's good old affirmative action at play. Now, it notes that Congress enacted Title 642, that's USC 2000D, as part of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. In 1973, though, it says, the federal government added to the law a new rule, disparate impact. That was not part of the law, at least not originally, right? They say that was not part of the law. The term disparate impact refers to the concept of imposing liability on a federal fund recipient only because there may be different outcomes for different people, not based on prejudice or intent, and that prior disparate impact rule was already enjoined in one state, prohibiting DOJ from enforcing it there. Again, good old affirmative action, right? Affirmative action, equality of outcome. They say the department's new rule reflects the best reading of Title VI, as the Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized for over 20 years prior to, again, that. They say Title VI has and will continue to prohibit intentional discrimination, intent of violating a law. The department's new rule ensures that recipients of federal funding will be judged on the actual conduct, not on statistical outcomes or circumstances beyond their control. Well, Judge, not enough people of this race applied. I didn't get enough lesbian midgets. What can I say? It's that kind of thing. Now it says, despite decades of case law, the department's prior Title VI disparate impact regulations remained on the books, sowing confusion and creating costly compliance obligations for states, local governments, nonprofits, and private organizations receiving federal financial assistance. And it says this new rule eliminates these burdens, promotes consistent enforcement across agencies, and restores public confidence in civil rights law by aligning the department's regulations with the Constitution. Again, a pretty significant revision of things. Now, when you want to talk about the older interpretations of the Civil Rights Act, prior, original forming of it, again, it was about, black students should be able to go to schools, and you can't block a black student from going to school. That was a big part of the civil rights movement. Black employees should be given equal opportunity to apply for government jobs. You should not have agencies or offices or whatever else discriminating against people. This was an outpouring of the Civil Rights Act, right? Or the Civil Rights Movement. That was reinterpreted in the 70s with good old affirmative action. And affirmative action basically looked at the impact, right? Well, is there a systemic bias? Is there something deeper in us that makes us want to hire people or allow students in who represent a race we like versus one we don't? And the way they did it was just by looking at the broader outcome, right? Well, obviously there's more of this color and less of that color, so there must be a discrimination here. So we need to let more of them in, and if you don't, well, we can sue them. And so what that created was legal pressure, and that legal pressure forced anybody getting government money, and even a lot of private businesses later, to refuse to hire some people based on identity and be forced to hire others based on identity. And the result of that is you would get people who are less qualified, people who, again, people who had gone to school for their whole life and were overachievers were not allowed to get jobs because of the color of their skin, because of their identity. Under the Biden years, first under Obama during his second term, really, that was also reinterpreted with the new interpretations of like identity politics, gender identity in particular, where you can identify as anything. Well, Judge, this government agency does not have enough three-spirit tree people. I identify as a three-spirit tree person, therefore they're discriminating against me, and I demand they pay me a lot of money. And the judge says, you know what? I believe it's true. They don't have a single one of those. How dare they be so discriminatory? That's all changing now. And I know I've talked to some of you actually off the record in terms of seeing this in practice already at some businesses. Businesses are already implementing this, not even just in the United States, but outside of the United States. There are businesses already putting this into action. And basically what it is they're not even allowed to look at these things. They can't look at your race. They can't look at your gender. They can't look at these things. They just see the person. They just see the qualifications. And that's what protects them from getting sued under this new interpretation. Now look, in other news, the United States has a brand new national security strategy, and this is a huge shift. A huge shift. It changes what America is, basically. I'll be going into what it all means after we come back from a quick break.
All right, just a pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. The United States has a brand new national security strategy, and this is a big deal, not just in terms of policy. This changes what we represent globally as a nation. And it kind of talks about where we've gone wrong in the past. Let me show you this. This is the actual report. And briefly on this, it has actually really broad bipartisan support. It has already been passed by the House in a huge, it was bipartisan. Democrats, Republicans actually agreed with each other and they passed it. Going to the Senate now, it'll probably also pass on bipartisan terms. But let me show you what it says here. It says how American strategy went astray. And it says to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful nation, it says America's strategy since the end of the Cold War have fallen short. They have been laundry lists of wishes or desires and states. And it says have not clearly defined what we want, but instead stated vague platitudes and have often misjudged what we should want. I think a lot of Americans would have some complaints over our attempts of, let's say, regime change or fighting the commies and the results we encountered where, we arm one group to fight the Soviets and they turn into the Taliban like the Mujahideen did. Where we, give guns to one group and they end up becoming like brutal totalitarians also. Or, for example, we fight a very long war and then regulate it so our American troops can't shoot unless shot at first in a war that revolves around ambushes and let our young men get murdered and then call them baby killers like in Vietnam. And so a lot of people were not very happy about what happened, right? Americans really, I think, have, their spirits have been hurt by bad regulations, bad policies, and the demonization of what we've tried to accomplish to fight against the communist takeover of the world. But it says here, after the end of the Cold War, American foreign policy elites convinced themselves that permanent American domination of the entire world was in the best interest of our country, which I'd say probably hasn't worked so well. I think a lot of people don't seem to like us very much. It says, yet the affairs of other countries are of our concern only if their activities directly threaten our interests. This is big, by the way. The affairs of other countries are only our concern if their activities directly threaten our interests. Now, a lot of people might be saying, well, what about China? What about Russia? What about Nigeria or Somalia or whatever else, right? So the Trump administration right now is actually saying that these countries do impact our interests. When he's talking about the persecution of Christians abroad, when he's talking about censorship policies in Brazil, trying to censor Americans for that matter, when the United Kingdom is trying to regulate American free speech, yeah, that impacts our interests. They're pushing back on this. One thing they also state in terms of, well, what do we do about China? Does this mean America is just going to trade because it's in our interest, national interest, and we don't care? The report, it's huge, so I won't go over every detail of it, but it actually does address that. As part of that, it does say that America will not let itself fall behind in terms of not being a global superpower. And if a country is trying to challenge or unseat us as that, then we will fight back. And so that was kind of a direct jab right at the CCP. This strategy does include, it seems, direct competition with the CCP. But it continues here stating, our elites badly miscalculated America's willingness to shoulder forever global burdens to which the American people saw no connection, it says, to national interest. It says they overestimated America's ability to fund simultaneously a massive welfare, regulatory, administrative state, which of course we saw. It says alongside a massive military, diplomatic intelligence system. Basically what it's saying is that these globalist systems where we've been trying to fight wars while at the same time having just a massive welfare state is not sustainable, right? So it says this massive military, diplomatic intelligence and foreign aid complex where in addition to funding welfare and illegal immigrants and everything else here, it has also caused a problem where we're trying to fight wars abroad, paying huge amounts of money, and frankly, it's just not sustainable. And a lot of Americans are very unhappy about it. Our attempts at nation building in Afghanistan, our attempts at nation building in Iraq, our attempts to give food to Africa and all these other things, a lot of it has not really gone anywhere. A lot of it backfired. A lot of it was just thrown out, for that matter, like in Afghanistan, where we spent all these years building up the Afghan National Army, and we just let the Taliban take them over in 1 week. Now it says this: they placed hugely misguided and destructive bets on globalism and so-called free trade that hollowed out the very middle class and industrial base on which American economic and military preeminence depend. It says they allowed allies and partners to offload the costs of their defense onto the American people, and sometimes to suck us into conflicts and controversies central to their interests, but it says peripheral or irrelevant to our own. And, of course, this ties into how many countries does America basically pay for the military of? We effectively subsidize Canada's and Western Europe's, welfare system because we pay for their defense. If you look at where a country puts its money, right? Look at the United States, for example. Where does our taxpayer dollars go? Well, mostly like Medicaid and defense. And if we were to dismantle most of our military and just, take all that extra money and put it into something else, well, that's basically what Canada has done. That's basically what Western Europe has done. America's global military presence has allowed these countries to basically not pay nearly as much into their militaries. They do a bit, but look at NATO funding and the huge disparities and them just ignoring it when America asked them to pay more. Many countries in the world have done this. America effectively acts as the military for much of the free world. And America, it turns out, has even been subsidizing through indirect means costs of medications, research, the low cost of pharmaceuticals for most of the free world. And America has basically been funding a lot of the welfare programs for much of the free world, including throughout Africa and many parts of Latin America, through NGOs and globalist organizations, United Nations operations and otherwise, getting a huge amount of American funding. And so the question is this in America's interest? Do these countries like us more because we've done that? No, they hate us, they despise us, they rob us, scam us, and take advantage of us. They call us piggy land and things like that, right? This has not improved our image with these countries despite us doing that much for them. And at the same time, Americans allowing them to tariff us, allowing them to trade with us at a massive disparity to our own finances. To make trade deals with us where the American people lose on huge, huge amounts. What it's arguing here is that this is not central to the interests of the United States. And even worse than that, when these countries get pulled into wars, we get pulled in too. Israel is a big example of this. They go to war with Iran, and they wanted us to go to war with Iran too. And maybe we kind of did. We went and bombed their nuclear facilities, which I do believe that was in America's interest to do that. But I don't think being pulled into a broader regional war would be in our interest. And this is kind of where it's at. There were reports that Trump was actually kind of clashing over that. And it says as well that they lashed American policy. It says that they lashed American policy to a network of international institutions, as I mentioned, like the NGOs and so on, some of which are driven by outright anti-Americanism and many by a transnationalism that explicitly seeks to dissolve individual state sovereignty in some. And again, you can think like the world, different globalist organizations, right? You can think globalist organizations promoting things like the multi-state world order, this idea of the multipolar world order, which is designed to eliminate individual state sovereignty, to bring to the table NGOs, nonprofit organizations, international globalist businesses, community leaders and so on for shared global governance. They've actually been doing this openly. Openly they've been doing this. It adds, in sum, not only did our elites pursue a fundamentally undesirable and impossible goal, it says in doing so they undermined the very means necessary to achieve that goal, the character of our nation, upon which its power, wealth, and decency were built. The whole idea that America represents something of the free world, in other words, the very idea that America represents a different interpretation of the role of government. We sacrificed that. We destroyed it for the sake of this globalist interest, which has been acting against American interest. Now it continues on the second part. It says, President Trump's necessary welcome correction, it says none of this was inevitable. President Trump's first administration proved that with the right leadership, making the right choices, it says, all of the above could and should have been avoided. It adds in much else achieved. And, Trump was pretty much challenged by the entire globalist system because they accused him of it, and they're kind of right. he was dismantling it. Trump, in his first term, tried to. They kind of succeeded, kind of didn't. In his second term, he's doing a lot more, dismantling that kind of globalist world order and reasserting what America represents. Now it says, he and his team successfully marshaled America's greatest strengths to correct course and begin ushering in a new golden age for our country. It says to continue the United States on the path. On the path is the overarching purpose of President Trump's second administration and of this document. And it gets into what this actually means, right? It says the questions before us now are, what should the United States want? What are available means to get it? And how can we connect ends and means into a viable national security strategy? And that's what it goes into. Now, this is a pretty long report. After that, the strategy goes into what America stands for, what we are as a nation, what do we value? It goes into the American ideas of, we want kind of the American dream. We want the old house and the white picket fence and the golden retriever and the good 9-to-5 job and so on. We want that decent American dream. We want our rights to not be trampled on. We want affordable housing. We want capitalism, true capitalism. And we want the rest of the world to basically not try to crush the rights of others. Then it goes into what we're going to do about it and what we need to do to achieve that. And then it goes into the actual strategy. Now, in terms of what it says on how to achieve this is a big deal because what this goes into now is what's going to be happening over the next at least a year, but probably longer than that, right? This is what it says America is going to do. It says, first of all, get this, the era of mass migration is over. And this includes not even in the United States, but even outside, because this is now part of American foreign policy. The Trump administration being implemented right now as we speak, the State Department is declaring mass migration is a threat, an existential threat to Western civilization. And mass migration is a human rights abuse of the Western world, meaning you could say that people in the United States, their human rights are being abused by the impouring of just mass migration. Same thing with the UK, same thing with Canada, same thing with Germany. This is a human rights abuse. It says, who a country admits in its borders, in what numbers, and from where, will inevitably define the future of that nation. Any country that considers itself sovereign has the right and duty to define its future. It says throughout history, sovereign nations prohibited uncontrolled migration and granted citizenship only rarely to foreigners, who also had to meet a demanding criteria. The West's experience over the past decade vindicates this enduring wisdom, meaning we've learned by doing the wrong thing. We've seen how people come in from the third world and they just import the third world and kind of destroy the countries they go to. It says in countries throughout the world, mass migration has strained domestic resources because a lot of them go on welfare, overwhelming majority in some countries. It says it increased violence and other crime like the rape gangs and the cartels and the street gangs we have in America. It says it weakened social cohesion. This is interesting because when you view your neighbors having the same culture as you, same holidays, same basic ideals, same fundamental values, same thing they want for a country, you feel a connection with your neighbor. When you have nothing to do with your neighbor, you don't have social cohesion. Your country is no longer united. It said it distorted labor markets, again, the more competition and fewer opportunities, and undermined national security. Think terrorism, threats of terrorism. Why do you need to have these huge concrete barriers around the Christmas markets? It's so terrorists from other countries don't drive their trucks through and try to mass murder a bunch of men, women, and children because their religion tells them that murdering people will get them into heaven, right? It's human sacrifice, right? They think that human sacrifice will get them into heaven. It says the era of mass migration must end. It says border security is the primary element of national security. It says we must protect our country from invasion, and this is big because they're actually calling this invasion now, not migration, invasion. Not just from unchecked migration, but from cross-border threats such as terrorism, drugs, espionage, and human trafficking. It says a border controlled by the will of the American people, as implemented by their government, is fundamental to the survival of the United States as a sovereign republic. Meaning the survival of the United States is being threatened by mass migration, and America is going to regard this now as one of those priorities. Now the question is, to what extent will they achieve the ending of mass migration? We'll have to wait and see. Now it says another one, protection of core rights and liberties. And this is something I care a lot about, right? The good old Constitutional Bill of Rights. It says the purpose of the American government is to secure the God-given natural rights of American citizens. That is a huge statement. By stating this, the U.S. government is reasserting what government is. Government is not meant to be your nanny. Government is not meant to be your big brother. Government is not meant to be some totalitarian dictatorship in charge of, like micromanaging your life. The interpretation here goes back to the original interpretation from the Founding Fathers. It says that we have God-given rights, and the purpose of government is to defend our God-given rights. We have freedom. Government exists solely to protect our freedom. It says, to this end, departments and agencies of the United States government have been granted fearsome powers. Those powers must never be abused, whether under the guise of de-radicalization, like we saw under Biden, where they were going after the MAGA extremists and the Christian extremists and the Catholic extremists, right? They were saying if you didn't believe in this new world of gender ideology and so on, you were radicalism. It says protecting our democracy or any other pretext. It says when and where those powers are abused, abusers must be held accountable. And this is interesting because what the Trump administration is saying, the people who should be accountable are the people within the government who have been effectively abusing the American people by targeting them based on these types of narratives. Defending democracy, de-radicalization. It says in particular the right of free speech, freedom of religion and of conscience, and the right to choose and steer our common government are core rights that must never be infringed. I wish they put the Second Amendment in there too, but you can't ask for everything, right? But it says, regarding countries that share or say they share these principles, the United States will advocate strongly that they be upheld in letter and spirit. Meaning if you want to work with us, if the United Kingdom wants to do business with the United States and have, good agreements, if Canada wants to trade with us, if Mexico wants to work with us, these countries need to respect the human rights that we believe government is instituted to guard. At the very base level, what they're saying here, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and that's about, the fundamental core of it all. It says, quote, we will oppose elite-driven anti-democratic restrictions on core liberties in Europe, the Anglosphere, and the rest of the democratic world, especially among our allies. So get ready, Europe. The good old Bill of Rights is coming your way, or America just might not work with your country, and they can't really not have that at this point. It says burden sharing and burden shifting. This is really interesting, right? The next point here. It says burden sharing and burden shifting. The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas, right? Atlas holding up the sky, are over. It says we count among our many allies and partners dozens of wealthy, sophisticated nations that must assume primary responsibility for their regions and contribute far more to our collective defense. That means Canada, that means Western Europe, that means Japan, Japan is one of the better examples of countries that has stepped up to the plate on this. If NATO, for example, wants American support, they need to make Spain and other countries pay into it, even if they don't want to. The reality is America has basically been subsidizing the defense of many countries on Earth. And it's saying here, if you're going to be your ally on that front, you need to actually pull your own weight. It says President Trump has set a new global standard with the Hague Commitment, which pledges NATO countries to spend 5% of GDP on defense, and which our NATO allies have endorsed and must now meet. No more free rides for Western Europe, for NATO, in other words. And it says as well, continuing President Trump's approach of asking allies to assume primary responsibility for their regions, He's even telling Western Europe, hey, Ukraine is your battle, not ours. That's your backyard. Deal with it, not us. He says the United States will organize a burden-sharing network with our government as a convener and supporter, meaning we'll help you, but we're not going to do it all for you. It says this approach ensures that burdens are shared and that all such efforts benefit from broader legitimacy. It says the model will be targeted partnerships that use economic tools to align incentives, share burdens with like-minded allies, and insist on reforms that anchor long-term stability. Now, you might say, well, what about countries not part of this that we want to defend? Like, what about, what about if some Balkan country goes to war with Russia or so on? Are we going to go and aid them? What if a country is not an American ally? What if a country that we have nothing to do with is being taken over or persecuted? Well, we'll have to see. Based on what Trump's been saying, basically, we're not going to get pulled in other people's conflicts. This is a very like George Washington era type policy. We're not going to get dragged into every bloody conflict of every country on earth anymore. If it's not in our national interest, then it's not in our national interest. Although we have seen that Trump has been trying to negotiate peace deals even between countries that have nothing to do with us. For example, what's happening in Africa right now. He's trying to negotiate peace deals. For example, he's trying to negotiate a peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand, although not very effectively right there. It's a complicated area. He's trying to do this. And as part of the peace deals, trying to get an American presence with like rare earth mineral mining or timber or some kind of trade deal as well. Now it says this strategic clarity will allow the United States to counter hostile and subversive influences efficiently while avoiding the overextension and diffuse focus that undermined past efforts. America has been too spread out, in other words. It says the United States will stand ready to help potentially through more favorable treatment on commercial matters, technology sharing, and defense procurement, those countries that willingly take more responsibility for security in their neighborhoods and align their export controls with ours. Meaning, don't tariff us. Don't, for example, restrict us from working with you, and don't expect us to pay for all your stuff if you're doing that to us. Now, this is interesting. It says realignment through peace. Seeking peace deals at the president's direction, which gets into what I was saying about Trump trying to negotiate peace with countries that we kind of have nothing to do with, right? Thailand and Cambodia is a great example. We have Cambodia is basically a CCP proxy state. They're heavily controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. America has very little interest there. Thailand, a little more so, but not as much. And so for us to try to go there and do something, trying to negotiate peace at least, it's not really something that's in America's interests. But Trump does have a policy for this. It says this: seeking peace deals at the president's direction, even in regions and countries peripheral to our immediate core interests, is an effective way to increase stability, strengthen America's global interests, influence, realign countries and regions towards our interest, and open new markets. The resources required boil down to presidential diplomacy, which our great nation can embrace only with competent leadership. Meaning, while it might not be in our immediate interest to actually care about what happens in some of these countries, by helping negotiate peace, we're establishing what America stands for globally, which is in our interest. It says the dividends at the end of a long-standing conflict, lives saved, new friends made, can vastly outweigh the relatively minor cost of time and attention. America will try to be a peacemaker, not get involved in the conflicts, but say, hey, little country, you're gonna lose. Give them this. We'll bring in some business. Both of you will be better in the end. You're going to lose. We're not going to pay for your war, but we'll help you find peace. And that's basically the message Trump is also sending to Zelensky and Ukraine as all of his cronies send money to Malta. Now it says here as well, economic security, finally, because economic security is fundamental to national security, we will work to further strengthen the American economy with an emphasis on balanced trade. The United States will prioritize balancing our trade relations, reducing trade deficits, opposing barriers to our exports, and ending dumping, like from the Chinese Communist Party, and other anti-competitive practices that hurt American industries and workers, such as them putting restrictions on us 100% tariffs on American cars going to Japan and, Germany, which has now been stopped, and other things like that, where countries massively tariff us and we just never did anything in return. It says we seek fair reciprocal trade deals with nations that want to trade with us on a basis of mutual benefit and respect. But our priorities must and will be our own workers, our own industries, and our own national security. It also says securing access to critical supply chains and materials, which is a big deal because the CCP has been trying to corner the market on that. It says, as Alexander Hamilton argued in the Republic's earliest days, the United States must never be dependent, it says, on any outside power for core components, from raw materials to parts to finished products. This is a big deal, by the way, necessary to the nation's defense or economy. It says we must re-secure our independent, it says, basically our independent, reliable access to the goods we need to defend ourselves and preserve our way of life. And I'll get into this in a sec, but it says this will require expanding America's access to critical minerals and materials while countering predatory economic practices like China, for example, trying to create a global monopoly on rare earth minerals and everything else. It says, moreover, the intelligence community will monitor key supply chains and technological advances around the world to ensure we understand and mitigate vulnerabilities and threats to American security and prosperity. This is a massive deal because we can talk about manufacturing, which it goes into next, and I'll get into manufacturing after. Manufacturing in American industry is not just the factories. It's not just the end markets. An economy is an entire ecosystem, right? It's the local storefront, the mom and pop or the big corporation, whichever you want to go to. It's the online shopping. It's the people who work there. It's the delivery drivers. It's the roads that make that all possible. It's the guys who build the cars and build all the parts for the cars. It is the systems behind that, the logistical systems that bring the materials, transport all the goods to the box stores, everything else, the truckers, the institutions behind that, the regulatory systems, going back into the manufacturing hubs that make all the things they import and all the tiny, tiny parts in every single one of those, down to the people transporting all of that, going to steel and iron and rare earth minerals and chips and everything else that are the core components, the timber, the stone, the concrete, everything else. That entire system, down to the mines, down to the guy chopping down the trees for timber, down to the guy, making the core components that are used in all these surface technologies. That is an economy. And America has most of the export of that economy. We buy the timber from Canada. We buy the steel from China. CCP controls the global steel industry. We buy the chips from this country. We buy this component from that place. We buy this from there. We bring in foreign workers to do these jobs and that job and this job. There's, the farmers and everything else. And effectively, we've exported all of this. The American economy is languishing. All we are is an end market to a globalist supply chain. A globalist supply chain where the jobs, the money for all that go elsewhere, and all we get are the paying for kind of the logistical systems and the imports and everything else to bring it to people's homes because Americans are big buyers. That has been the globalist economy now for a very long time. And what they're talking about is changing that, bringing that internally within the United States. That does not mean entirely, because this would basically destroy the economies of Canada and Mexico for the most part, and of China probably, and probably a lot of other countries. It probably will not be entirely, but we will build that up as a national security issue, making sure that if we went to war, we have wartime production, we have the factories, we have the materials, we have everything we need, and we have enough of that to make sure that in the case of an emergency, we would not need another country. We would have a secure supply chain. It also talks about reindustrialization, the bringing back of the American factory. It says the future belongs to the makers. It says the United States will reindustrialize its economy, reshore American production, meaning taking it back from China and India and Canada and Mexico. and encourage and attract investment in our economy and our workforce. Notably, Trump is even making business deals with other countries, and you could say this maybe is in foreign interest. Other countries are building their factories in America, they're investing in America, that is their business, and if they build it here, even if it's still a foreign company, just the factory is here, they still get a lot of the money from it. If they build it here, they don't pay tariffs, and that's kind of the way they've gone about it. It says this is to bring it back to encourage and attract investment, and it says with a focus on the critical and emerging technology sector that will define the future. Think AI and chips and everything else. It says we will do so through the strategic use of tariffs, again, and new technologies that favor widespread industrial production in every corner of our nation. I assume they mean automation here, automation and AI. Raise living standards, it says, for American workers, and ensure that our country is never again reliant on any adversary. That's a big jab to China, by the way, because they're the main one. Present or potential for critical products or components. And also, again, with the manufacturing, it says, reviving our defense industrial base. Because, you know, we actually buy, a lot of our military contracts go to like foreign companies. I don't know if they're talking about canceling that because you'd think America, we want to have the best stuff around, right? In fact, a lot of the guns, a lot of the bombs we buy from like, you know, European manufacturers. I don't know if they mean that, but they do say reviving our defense industrial base. It says a strong and capable military cannot exist without a strong, capable defense industrial base. The huge gap, it says, demonstrated in all of this, demonstrated in recent conflicts between low-cost drones and missiles. We buy our drones, a lot of them from China, the low-end ones, versus the expensive systems required to defend against them, has laid bare our need to change and adapt. The old school, up until now, American system, expensive tanks, expensive jets, we can only buy a handful of them. Other countries are buying, you know, cheap little drones you can buy on the internet for like $100 and they're dropping bombs on people's faces. Which is going to be better? If you can use a little $100 drone carrying a bomb and blow up a, you know, massively expensive tank, which we've been seeing in Ukraine, that is not a good way to spend your money. They're talking larger scale and cheaper as the future. It says America requires a national mobilization to innovate powerful defenses at low cost, to produce the most powerful, the most capable modern systems and munitions at scale, and to reshore our defense industrial chains. In particular, we must provide our warfighters with full range of capabilities, ranging from low-cost weapons that can defeat most adversaries, up to the most capable high-end systems necessary for a conflict with a sophisticated enemy. So it goes into this, right? It goes into all these things. Afterwards, let me do a time check. Afterwards, it goes into energy dominance and to preserving America's financial system. Again, this goes into, for example, making sure we don't sign stupid energy deals where America's energy system basically gets totally dismantled and we send it all to China, like, for example, the Paris Climate Accord did. Net zero policies that harm Europe and the United States and then subsidize our adversaries, it says, meaning China. And then it goes into preserving America's financial sector and dominance, basically maintaining the US dollar as the world reserve currency. This goes into one thing that could be problematic, though, because it talks about the future of digital currencies. America has been trying to avoid the idea of a centralized bank digital currency. That's a very controversial thing. They're not talking about that per se, but they are talking about digital finance. We'll see what that means in terms of practice, but they're moving towards that to make the American dollar forever competitive globally. And we'll see how it goes. But basically, this is the new interpretation of what America is, the new interpretation of how we work with other countries, the new interpretation of what we care about, and basically the new interpretation of how we're going to negotiate trade, how we're going to negotiate defense deals, regional peace, how business deals are going to be made, how tariffs are done, how we criticize countries for not following free speech standards like Western Europe right now. There's a big conflict over that. This is the new America. This is what America now stands for. And it actually has pretty broad bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans are overwhelmingly getting behind this. This is very bipartisan, meaning it seems that we all mostly agree on it, right? You still have some who don't, of course, but for the most part, this is bipartisan. This is something Americans do agree on, and it's a very big deal. All right, I said questions, comments, anything you want to talk about. Let's jump into some questions. And I wanted to go over this because this is a big change actually. Troy NM, you're saying make discrimination disgraceful again. Yeah, you're talking about the new, or you could say old interpretation of civil rights, right? We're going back to the older interpretation of civil rights where you don't hire based on the color of a person's skin. A person should be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, like good old Martin Luther King Jr. said. And we didn't have that for a long time because, again, of policies that required hiring people for numbers effectively. Affirmative action laws, that is now gone. Affirmative action has now died, at least for now. And we'll see what this means for businesses. We'll see what this means for people applying for jobs. May the best man or best woman win. And if you identify as something else, they don't recognize it. So it's a very new time for the United States. Angela Rodolo 6584, you're saying, so true. I had not realized DEI was being taught at our small town school until my son stated he would not receive college scholarship because he is considered as an oppressor. That's so sad. I know my daughter actually has a friend that happened to. One of her friends, he's an Asian kid. I won't detail everything. He's a huge overachiever. He did like the pre-preparation for SATs, super overachiever. The kid was like playing like really advanced violin at a super early age. Amazing grades. He's been applying for like private schools and he's gotten rejected based on identity politics because he's Asian, and a lot of these schools say there's too many Asians. So he's being denied access while being a huge overachiever, being denied access because of his race. And there are schools doing that. It's crazy, I think. It's really crazy. And you're going to end up with a lot of people who are just not qualified for what they get. And it's actually bad for some minorities too. Because, you do have some people who push themselves and they don't feel that they're recognized for it. Because what do people say now, right? If you're a minority and you're in a position and you make a mistake, what do people call you? What do they call you now? They call you a diversity hire. And, it's true in some cases, but it's not true in others. And so a person who's really worked for it, it's like you're not recognized anymore because you're being judged by people who did not earn it, no matter how much you applied yourself. And then you have a lot of people who over-applied themselves and they're like, well, why did I even bother? Because I can't get it now because of something beyond my control, the color of my skin. It's something I can't have anything to do with, right? Unless you're Michael Jackson and you change it. What are you going to do about it? All right, Ashley from California, you're saying, how will the DOJ ensure the law actually is blind and equally applies to all? There are many DAs and judges that work based off a skewed view of social justice. How can they ensure fair treatment for all? Okay, so from what I understand, realistically, you will probably watch some random district judge try to overturn this. Because of the new Supreme Court interpretation of the reach of a district judge, it will not go beyond a state and it will be challenged. So you're probably going to have some random judge in California or a random judge in Hawaii or middle of nowhere, who's of course extremely woke, just say, you know what, this is racist and we're not going to interpret it this way, or they're going to challenge the Justice Department and sue the Justice Department and try to reinterpret all this. Why does that not really work? Two reasons. First of all, it's not really going to work because, again, the Supreme Court has now determined that district judges are not able to put holds on laws for the entire nation, meaning it will stay localized. Number two, what did the Supreme Court say about about affirmative action. The Supreme Court has basically overturned affirmative action. And so the Justice Department actually has a Supreme Court ruling they can use to very easily challenge a lot of this. Affirmative action right now is basically dead. Again, because the Supreme Court made some determinations on it. Doesn't mean there's going to be loopholes, because there will, but overarchingly, there's already a major determination on this. So may the best man or woman win on that. I don't want to name names, but I was talking with someone in the chat, and they mentioned they work in a big business that works on hiring. And they were saying that actually they've already seen this get implemented, because businesses don't want to get sued. Businesses and schools and everything else, they don't want to get sued. And because the federal government, okay, so this is the other side of it. These laws, this interpretation does not apply so much to your mom and pop shop. If you go and try to apply for a job at your local store and you feel that they took your race into consideration, you can sue them. Like you actually can, if you feel that you've been discriminated against based on race, religion, creed, or gender, or age, or whatever. You can sue on a lot of things. There are many states in the United States that have laws on this individually, in addition to national law. New York City, for example, you can sue pretty easy on this. If you try to go to a restaurant, and I know cases like this, and they reject you because of your religion, you can sue them. There are human rights divisions within a lot of courts. That's one side of it. But the bigger part as it applies to this is that it's institutions that receive government funding. So think all the big universities, think for nonprofit organizations, think government agencies. And so what's going to happen is, if these institutions continue to do this, the federal government, aside from possibly bringing lawsuits or backing up people if they want to file lawsuits or file complaints with civil rights divisions and so on, what this also opens the door for is for the federal government to pool funding for organizations, like the Trump administration is threatening to do against the major academic institutions. A lot of universities are getting threatened to lose federal financing because of racial discrimination. And so that's the way a lot of it's going to look. Judy Akeem, you're saying, don't fix demographic level issues at the point of the outcome. That's just impossible and stupid. Yeah, I agree. I agree on two parts. One is because, okay, let's put it this way. If you go somewhere, let's give a hypothetical and a very surface level interpretation. If you go and get in line for something, and they have a white people line and a colored people line, right? And the colored people line has 5 workers at it, and they're letting people through like this. Or maybe it's the white people line, letting people through like this. And you have 1 worker at yours, and they're very slow. If you see that some people are allowed to have preferential treatment, are you going to blame the institution, or are you going to dislike the people in that line getting preferential treatment beyond you? Different people will feel differently, but it's probably going to be a bit of both. And so let's use a real world example. If you're a student and you've been working your entire life trying to get the best grades, doing preparations for the SATs, volunteering, pushing yourself to the utmost extent, doing your best on tests, and your entire school life, you've seen kids that do not apply themselves getting the same grades as you, getting passing grades, getting benefits, and you're saying, well, you know what? The school doesn't care, but when I go to college, they're going to care. And you apply for a college, and they say, no, we're going to give access to this guy who never applied himself, who got a free pass, a free ride, who failed every test and was given a passing grade anyway, over you, who applied yourself the whole time because of the color of his skin. What do you think that student is going to think? Do you think they're going to be like, okay, that guy deserved it, good for him? Or do you think they're going to become more racist? Right? What do you think? What do you think they're going to think about the institution at that point? Do you think they're going to believe the institutions actually function? No. What that will cause is younger people becoming more racist because you're creating racial tension through these policies. And it will also cause a loss in trust in the institutions because they will see that the institutions are not taking common sense into practice. The institutions are discriminating based on their identity for the sake of another, calling it anti-discrimination, and then oftentimes calling that kid a racist or privileged or whatever else, when in reality they've been denied privilege because of nothing more than something beyond their control, which is the color of their skin. You're going to create more racism if you do that. You're going to create more discrimination if you do that. And I think that's kind of where we're at with the younger generations, where you watch a lot of young kids now, and they're really racist, right? People our age, we're like, you call us racist. We say, no, we're not, I swear. Some of these younger kids, you call them racist, and like, yeah, I know. Like that's the kind of people you're creating with those policies, because they don't care anymore. They've been called these things by the institutions, by the schools. You're an oppressor, you're a colonial, you're a colonist, you're a colonizer. And they're like, yeah, I am. And I don't care what you say anymore. That is a dangerous situation for a country, because what you've destroyed then is like social cohesion and trust in the institutions. That is a terrible state. And the other problem is you're going to have a lot of unqualified people in important positions. You are going to have diversity hires. We're going to manufacture the old idiocracy. You know what I mean? You're going to have institutions with really unqualified people. And what are people going to call them? They're going to call them diversity hires. They're not going to be recognized. They're going to be more discriminated against. People are going to believe they did not earn their position and they were only given it because of their race or gender or identity. And that is going to cause more problems for society, more divisions, more hatred, and it's just going to fuel the flames. And I think we've seen that, actually. Jen Reinbold, you're saying, can big businesses be trusted to really care for Americans? No. No, they're interested in maximizing profits, right? Basically. Look at the way they invest in China, right? You say, we know that IBM helped the German Nazis. Greed seems to rule. Yeah. Well, we know how many big companies support the Chinese Communist Party, right? I think in the future, once the Chinese Communist Party comes to an end, which I think it will, once there are human rights tribunals in China, which I think there will be, once there's justice and the world sees, wow, that regime killed 150 or 100 million people, probably more. Communism killed about 150 million, but if you go by current estimates, the CCP has killed somewhere between like 70 and 100 million people, and counting, by the way. When that day comes, we will view the Chinese Communist Party as being just as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis, if you go by just the amounts of human misery it created. And if you look at the number of companies and investment firms and money being sent there and your pension being sent there, it's pretty dire, actually. If you look at the way that major corporations, major news organizations have sacrificed honesty, even hiding information because they don't want to get kicked out of China, because they don't want to lose business deals for their parent companies. And keep in mind that most media in the United States are controlled by about 5 or 6 corporations, right? There's parent companies. It's these megacorps. A lot of them work in China. A lot of them suppress human rights. A lot of them will punish people, censor on behalf of the CCP. The whole 9 yards. So yeah, they are openly willing to sacrifice American interest, openly willing to sacrifice American values, openly willing to censor themselves on behalf of that regime, and that's because of money. It is because of financial interest. And so you're talking about, do these countries really care about Americans? No, they do not. Why? Because they're globalists. They're multinational corporations. They're not really American businesses. They're multinational corporations. Multinational corporations care about shareholders, and they have multinational shareholders. They're not singularly loyal. What makes them singularly loyal? Well, the threat of losing business deals, the threat of regulation, the threat of being denied markets. That makes them care about it. You know, it is the... Okay, let's do another example, okay? A few years ago, do you remember what a lot of the big corporations were promoting? They were promoting trans rights and having a guy in a dress hold up their product and smile for the camera. And they were talking about, you know, all these woke policies, and the commercials were that. And then every Pride Month, they changed their logo to a rainbow flag, except in Dubai and, you know, the Middle East, because they don't do it there. Why don't they do it there, by the way? Good question, right? Why did they not change their logos for those countries? You tell me. That was the whole thing. And then what happened? Well, people started protesting against it. People started boycotting their products. Look at what happened to Budweiser. Look at what happened to Jaguar. Look at what happened to Target, right? When they did these types of things, and people basically protested against it and stopped buying their products. They realized it was bad for business to do it. So what did they do? Did anybody notice the last Pride Month how many companies did not change their logos to, you know, the rainbow flag? Most of them. Why is that? The simple answer is this: because they never cared about it from the beginning. It was always about money. And when the financial interest was to not do it rather than to do it, they stopped doing it. Why? Because it is and has always been about money. They will do what makes them money. And that is the reality. And it's true. A lot of these big companies, if it means having Chinese slaves, like the Muslim Uyghurs working in the garment industry, who basically do most of the garment industry, they're going to hire slaves. They don't care about slavery. It's cheap. And that's where they're at. If they have to work with a country that massacres, you know, Christians, they're going to do it. Why? Because they care about making money. If they're going to go work with a country that massively requires them to censor, they're going to do it. Why? Because they care about money. And they will only do that to the extent that the public to the extent that doing so is not punished. Only to the extent that doing so does not get them boycotted. That doing so only works to the extent that the American government does not say, hey, quit doing that. Which is what we're seeing right now through the Trump administration, by the way. And so, you know, I'm not one of these absolute free market guys. I think tyranny can exist both through government and through monopoly. I'm very much like a G.K. Chesterton era mind on this. That I think tyranny comes in many forms. And I think allowing monopolies to be formed that can then create domineering systems that just have no regard for human life or human rights or standards is just as bad as being dominated by like a mega, you know, big brother communist regime. Having the globalist world order of, you know, mega corporations and NGOs advising them on policy would be just as bad as having like the CCP controlling everything in my mind. I don't want either. I like the idea of being able to decide my own fate, and I don't like these people trying to preach to me about it. And that's where I'm at. All right, everyone, that said, I think we'll do one more. Jeremy Barker, you're saying the American people lost when our politicians allowed most U.S. manufacturing to be shipped overseas. Yeah, and we did. How many of you remember what life was like before NAFTA? How many of you remember what life was like before the free trade agreements with the Chinese Communist Party, like 99, right? It was 99, early 2000s. A lot of the free trade agreements with the CCP were formed it was under Clinton, right? Under Bill Clinton. Prior to that, you know, you could say the American economy was struggling a bit, but you know what? You could afford a house. It felt like America was a more united, more kind of singular idea. Not a culture. We still had a cultural pockets, but there was some kind of idea that united us. America was a very different place. And when we made NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada, and a lot of our factories just left the country, and a lot of Americans lost their jobs. When we started making we gave China most favored nation trading status, right, under Bill Clinton. And we sent a lot of our factories to China. We watched the American quality of life go like this. We watched housing prices go like this. We watched everything kind of just slide downhill. And in many ways, we lost the American dream. I do think that bringing back what was lost, rolling back the clock a bit, I do think the American quality of life could go back, and I think it will be significantly better. And at least that's what the new national strategy is. That is the new American national strategy. And as part of that, my prediction, you're going to watch, if we turn back the clock to like 99, which is basically what this does, you're going to watch the economies in Canada, in Mexico, in a lot of Europe and China go back to where they were prior to that. Meaning China's going to go back to the Stone Age. They're going to go back to being some dirty communist country. You're going to watch a lot of Western Europe probably not do so hot for a little bit. You're going to watch Mexico and Canada probably not do so well either. And maybe a lot of the world, but we'll see how a lot of these trade agreements go. I believe that will be a temporary state until the markets reset themselves, depending on how rapidly this is done. Because this can be done in a way that harms them a lot, or in a way that gives them buffer room to rejig things. Very likely, in order to maintain this, many countries, Canada, Western Europe, and others, will probably need to cut a lot of their social welfare programs, and that might mean Western Europe deporting a lot of illegal immigrants or denying them, welfare, because a lot of the welfare state is them. You might have to watch a lot of that change so as to not just totally destabilize some countries, depending on the scale and how rapidly it's done. So we shall see what happens. We'll see how this is rolled out, how much it is challenged, because there will be challenges. But on this, again, this is mostly bipartisan, and that says a lot. All right, everyone, that said, it is Thursday, so I will not see you until Monday. So thank you again so much for being here. What do you think in the chat? Tell me about it. I mean, do you think this is a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Do you have your doubts? Do you hope something was in there that is not? Tell me in the chat. Join me again on Monday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time for more great discussions. I will see you then. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.